Hi everyone, welcome to CI Diaries.
Sponsored by Wayside Publishing. I'm Carrie Toad.
And I'm Kristy Placido. Welcome to our final episode in our special series, Robust Reading.
So in part 1 of Robust Reading, we talked to you about pre-teaching, vocabulary, and structures, which we call establishing meaning.
And then in part 2, we spoke to you about how to select a text that's going to be a great fit for your students. And today we're going to talk about
like follow-up activities. What do you do once you're reading this text? How do you interact with it? What do you do alongside the text to keep the reading engaging?
Right.
When I think about follow-up activities to a text that I'm using in class, I always like to think in terms of what are the things that I like to do during the reading, like alongside the chapter, as I'm reading along during the chapter, versus the things that I like to do immediately following the chapter. Right. You know, I break them down. And honestly, there are even some things that I like to do pre-reading the chapter. So maybe we really would break them down into 3 different groups of things that we would do just before we read the chapter of the reader, just, alongside as we were reading along with the chapter of the reader, and, things that are activities or follow-ups that we would do post reading the chapter of a reader. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And I also would say that I think a lot of times when I talk to teachers, they want to know kind of like a formula. They want to know like, I do this, and then I do this. And I always tell people that when you're first learning something, it's kind of like you're following a recipe. But then as you get better at it, it's like you're learning to cook, right? And you're not following a recipe anymore, but you're like, okay, I'm going to try this spice. So it's not like a formulaic type of thing. And you do have some room to kind of put your own little expression in there of what you'd like to do. But I definitely think there is a general pattern of there's certain types of things we do pre-reading, then we read. And I know a lot of teachers sometimes are kind of like, well, what do I actually do? Like, how do we read? and then we do follow-up. So that is definitely kind of the pattern, but then there's a lot of flexibility within that pattern.
Agree with that. I think before reading, I tend to do, and sometimes the teacher's guides, if I am looking at a book that I'm going to adopt for my classroom, I would definitely look for a book with a strong teacher's guide, because a lot of times those I don't want to have to reinvent the wheel. And so having a book that has a strong teacher's guide is important. And a lot of times they have, one of the things I like about the Fluency Matters and Wayside books that we use is that they have those pre-reading kind of context clues or pre-reading fast match activities where I can do a little vocabulary exercise where I can show the students, look what you already know. Let's look at these cognates that are present in the chapters, because we've talked about this before in episodes. Kids don't always realize that a cognate is a cognate. So just calling their attention to the fact that, I do know that word. I just didn't realize I knew that word.
Right. I mean, we're literally just giving them tools to help them process the reading. So that's all pre-reading is. And I think when you have something that is going to be just inherently very easy for your students, you're not going to need to do as much pre-reading as you would with something that's got a little bit more uncertainty to it. Maybe there's something cultural that's unfamiliar to them, or there are going to be like several new vocabulary words in the chapter. You're going to approach something like that differently than you would if it was just really straightforward and super comprehensible.
And that's another reason that a teacher's guide is so wonderful. If there is a cultural thing that does need a little front loading, a lot of times there'll be a pre-reading slideshow that you can go through to kind of give them some cultural background before they dive into a chapter. Sometimes we're so into cultural topics because we've been to a country and we're so excited about teaching our students about this country, but they just don't have that same excitement that we have because they haven't been there and they haven't experienced that place. And, we're so passionate about these places that we've traveled because they become part of our heart. And to share that with them, once they see some pictures and once they've kind of been there on a virtual trip with us, that helps them get a little more invested alongside us.
Yeah. I also just am a huge believer in personalizing everything, bringing whatever it is that you're teaching your students about, finding ways to connect kids to that content, finding ways to connect something in their lives or their culture with whatever they're going to be experiencing in the classroom. And there are always ways that you can make those connections. I mean, if you're reading about...
And that's that actful interculturality piece, to connect their
Right.
own culture with the cultures they're studying.
And they invest more in it when they feel that there are some connections that they can find. Yes. So let's talk about what actually happens when you've done some pre-reading, and now the students are sitting in the class, books are in their hands. What do you actually do? Because I feel like teachers often that's the part that kind of feels scary to them. Like, I don't know what to do now. Like, we did these activities, but now we have these books. And it seems so silly when you think about it, because, well, you read. But, like, what does that process look like?
One of the things that I like that you do is that sometimes Kristy will put up on her screen, in the reading, the actual reading time, I think that it's important to read it, but not drag it out. Some of the things that kids say, when they come in from reading from English class, they read novels for, they might read Of Mice and Men for 6 weeks in English class, and so they get to feeling that a novel just
like
takes forever
it's like this,
to get
and they read
through.
it for 6 weeks. Right?
And so we don't want them to carry that feeling. And so I'm not saying that you have to bore through a reader in your classroom in 5 days, but what I'm saying is that we want to get through the text in a timely manner in the class. And so to go in and to sit down and to make the reading feel like kind of an experience to them at the beginning of the class, and then get to the follow-up. So I love that Kristy kind of sets the mood. Like, she'll put on her big screen in the classroom, she'll have, if it's set in a restaurant, she'll have an image of a restaurant up on the screen in the classroom. And so the scene is set there in a restaurant, and sometimes she'll have like a little mood music playing in the background. So as the students come in, they're sitting down to this really light mood music playing, with like maybe a restaurant themed like instrumental music, and they've got the restaurant in the background, and then they read through this chapter. So things like that are helpful in setting the scene for the chapter that you're about to read. And then really it's about reading the chapter together and trying to make it comprehensible and enjoyable to the students who you're reading it with.
Mm-hmm. So, Carrie, how much translation do you do when you're reading with your students?
It depends on the level. When we are reading our very first book in level 1 Spanish, we almost go line for line on translation. Me volleyballing back to them, making sure, because I want every kid in that classroom to feel successful. Now, when we're in level 4, I don't have to translate with them like that. When we come to a word that I think might be a stumper, or, at the end of a paragraph, we might go through and I might ask them some comprehension questions. I'm not even really translating. I'm just asking them comprehension questions, or I might ask them to, translate a sentence for me just to make sure that they understood it. But that's going to vary level by level. When you're with your novices, they need more. Just check and give me the translation back, because I need to see if you're understanding. Right. When you're with your intermediates, you don't need a translation to check comprehension. You need some comprehension questions to check comprehension.
Right. I would say I totally agree with that. When I'm working with a novice class, I do start out going sentence by sentence. I mean, I will read it in Spanish. I will ask them to tell me what it means in English. That doesn't mean like a strict word by word, like it has to be exact type of translation, but just like tell me that you understood it. And then I like to kind of, as soon as I'm able to, I like to transition into where maybe I'm reading a sentence and I'm just asking them what one word in the sentence means.
Yes.
And then maybe throwing some comprehension questions at them as well. Like not always going back to that translation, but I think it's important for us to remember that they are going to process their second language through their first language, whether we like it or not. So if we speak the same first language as our students, now if you're an ESL teacher, this is going to be a whole different approach. But if you and your students share a common language, why not capitalize on that? Why waste a resource that's so valuable? I mean, that's just the quickest, easiest way to make sure that comprehension is actually taking place.
And especially when reading skill is well known in the United States to be low. Like we know that we have struggling readers across the board. You can ask the English department at your school that reading levels, Lexile levels are very low across the board. And so this is somewhere that we know our students struggle. And so being able to scaffold them in their reading is something that we can help them with. Just by adding this little bit of translation. Kristy, when you read with your students, do you do a lot of reading aloud, like a lot of the reading aloud yourself?
I do, and I find that my students really prefer that for the most part. Even in my upper levels, I have always found that students like to be read to. And in fact, we affectionately call it story time. And I often will ask my students if they want to come and sit on the floor. And many of them, my freshmen love to sit on the floor and my seniors love to sit on the floor. And I'll pull up my chair just like I'm Miss Frizzle, and they'll all sit around me. And the kids that don't want to sit on the floor, they just pull up a chair. And it's fun. And it's kind of like a little bonding experience too. I mean, I think big kids like to feel that nostalgia of like being an elementary student sitting around their teacher. And we don't always read all together. I think that's an option I like to have available to my students, but as they get more confident in their own ability to read, I start to give them a little bit more freedom too, if they want to try reading on their own. And I know you do something similar with your concept of reading club. Yes.
I would say that probably 75% of the time we read all together. And then maybe 25% of a reader, they have a little more independence. But for me, and this is moving into our last point, when we read together, all of these, sometimes we'll read together and we'll do a smash doodle, one of Martina Bex's activities. As we read together, they're kind of doodling the activities. Or doodling what they hear. But then all of that reading moves us forward to getting to the follow-up. And the follow-up is where they really process what we've read. And so when you have the students in charge of reading, they don't always process it as well as when we are there to ask all the comprehension questions. But B, it goes a lot slower. And so you don't get to those follow-up activities. And the follow-up activities are where the real engagement in the classroom comes in. And so, having the teacher leading the reading part can be very valuable, because then you have time. If the reading takes you about 20 minutes of the class, then you get 25 or 28 or 30 minutes of your class period to do some kind of a really fun follow-up. And so that's what we'd like to talk next. Like, if you have this reading chunk at the beginning that's kind of teacher-led, where you read aloud with the students, where you really are asking comprehension questions, where you have the mood music, where you're reading all together as a class, then what do? What are your favorite follow-ups? Whenever you finish a reading, what are some of your favorite ways to follow up a chapter?
I mean, my go-to is usually some form of reader's theater, and I have a lot of different variations on reader's theater that I do. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So one that I love to do, and I don't do any of these all the time. I mean, I definitely try to keep everything varied. I like to keep them kind of, on their toes and not doing the same thing all the time. But I do like the idea of creating some kind of dramatization of whatever we just read. So one thing I do pretty frequently is I'll just have some actors get up and I will kind of coach them through reenacting in the scene. And I try to not do the entire chapter. I think that gets really out of hand and it's too long. It gets boring. I will choose a scene from the chapter that's really short and we'll just act out that one little scene. And if there's dialogue, I first of all don't try to incorporate a lot of dialogue in readers theater. I don't know how you feel about that, Carrie.
No,
but
same. Try to pick an action-y scene with not as much dialogue.
Yeah. Now, if there is dialogue, my favorite little trick is I will stand behind them and kind of be their voice, and then they'll just move their mouth like they're a puppet. And that's actually really funny.
Same.
It's really funny to watch. So the class enjoys that. But sometimes I'll even do just like a freeze frame where I'll just have students kind of create a little still vignette of different parts of the scene, and then I'll take photos of it. And then I'll put those photos in a slideshow. And then the next day we can review what we read. Before we read the next chapter, we can review what was happening in the previous chapter by looking at these photos. And they love it because they love to see themselves and they love to see their friends and their classmates. So it's always fun to incorporate the students into the lesson. And I also like to have them draw pictures. Like you mentioned the Smash Doodle.
Yes.
Drawing is a great way to get them to process the text again. And I think that's a lot of what we're doing is we're trying to get them to process that text a second time or a third time and just get their attention on the text without it feeling boring or repetitive.
I agree with you. That's why one of my favorite activities for a follow-up is your game, The Scene Machine. One of Kristy's games is The Scene Machine. I just take a big piece of butcher paper and I put students in groups of 4 and they kind of lay down on the floor with their butcher paper and they have the text in hand and they go through the chapter and then, whatever we've read so far. So if we're on chapter 5, they have all of the first 5 chapters to work with. Mm-hmm. And each student in the group has to pick a different scene from those first 5 chapters, and they illustrate it on this piece of butcher paper. So it's divided into 4 quadrants. They each illustrate a scene. But then they use the text, so they're rereading in the text, which is awesome. Like anytime you can get them digging back into the text and rereading. And now they have to take 2 different index cards, and on each index card, they write a different sentence directly from the text that describes what's happening in their illustration. So they have these 2 index cards with their sentences, and then they scramble up all the 8 index cards from their group. And then the other groups move around like game boards and they have to match up which sentences go with which illustrations. And so it lets every group in the room, they're getting all these repeated exposures to all the things that have happened in the text so far. So I love these opportunities to follow up and reread the text.
Yeah, and the best thing for me about Scene Machine is it's really no prep. If you have the supplies in your classroom, you just pull those supplies out and you go. I mean, there's you don't have to do anything. Loose.
They're
exactly.
Doing it. I also like Cindy Hitz's marker partner because that's another no prep game. You literally just need anytime you have some true false questions. If you have a teacher's guide for a reader and you have some true false questions, it's a game that's really engaging to follow up a chapter. You just line the kids up in 2 rows facing each other, 2 teams facing each other, and set a board marker on the ground in between the 2 rows so that each pair of students has a marker to grab. And you say the true or false statement. And if it's true, the students try to be the first to grab the marker that's between them, and the team with the most marker grabs at the end is the winner. And it's just such a fun game to play as a follow-up, but it gets them listening. Like it gets them listening and thinking about and processing that text. Like they don't want to grab it if it's false. So they have to really be attentive to what you're saying.
That one, too, can get a little out of hand. I do play it, but you really have to prep the students about your expectations before you do a game like that, because it can get a little heated sometimes. So, are there any other follow-up activities that you feel are just like a must mention?
I think that any type of follow-up that gives repeated input exposure, like I don't think you can go wrong with any follow-up that gives input-based exposure. Blukit, like all of those game-based things, I think you can make those input-based by making them comprehension questions that you're finding the answer to, or sentence, gap fill kinds of exercises. Like, that's what we're looking for. When you're looking for a type of follow-up that really enriches what you've read, that's the kind of thing that you're looking for. Something that gets students, when we think about language, like to be higher on Bloom's taxonomy, it's not just about remembering, it's about applying. And so, get them really thinking about and applying what they know, like where they have to think about and process what they learned in that chapter.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That is awesome. And so I wanted to finish off this is a question that we got in our email, and I wanted to just address this question. And I would also like to encourage any of you who might have questions for us or topics that you'd like us to explore, get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. So we got the question, what do you think is essential to have on your wall? So Carrie, what are the primary things that you feel like just absolutely you need to have as a resource on your wall for your students to see?
I have the ACTFL proficiency descriptors. I have a printable set of proficiency descriptors that are on my wall because for me, it has eliminated the whole how many words does this have to be, because I can just point and say, hey, remember, we're shooting to become intermediates, and so this is what we need to do. I have rejoinders, and I have the question words, and then I have some basic past tense verbs, and that's what I keep up all of the time. And so those things really help me just have a basic word wall that they can refer to all the time. What about you?
Yeah, I would say it's pretty similar for me. Now, I did retire from the classroom this past year, so I did have to take everything off my wall.
Woo!
But it's,
congratulations. You guys, Kristy is retired.
Well, I have a new job now, so I'm not really fully retired.
That's true. Kristy is doing new business.
I am. So I feel like what's, for me, the thing that I use the most on my wall is my question word posters. I just feel like I have my laser pointer in my hand almost all the time, and I'm just, in my novice level classes especially, I'm always pointing at those question words. And I don't really even think you need to have posters. You could just have them like written on your dry erase board, but something to refer to, because I think oftentimes when students don't understand a question, at the novice level especially, they probably didn't get the first word of the question. Yes. So
I agree with you 100%.
I do also really like to use rejoinders. I don't tend to have my rejoinders posters front and center. I tend to have them kind of sprinkled around the room. But I find that students really enjoy being able to have some instant language to use. And they do bring those into our class discussions because I think they think they're being cute. But I love it. I mean, please use my rejoinder posters to be cute. I'm here for it.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And we would love to hear from you. So feel free to leave us a comment wherever you're listening to this podcast or on our YouTube channel. Send us an email. We would love to hear from you. And we look forward to seeing you again next time.
See you soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.